I think I should start this video by explaining what inspired me to make it. A while ago, I rewatched the entirety of Breaking Bad with someone who had never seen it, and after watching the final episode, they told me that they thought the show would have been better if it were animated. And personally, I really disagree with that. But this got me thinking a lot about these different mediums of entertainment, animation and live action. Live action and animation are different in many ways, and the qualities that are unique to each medium may or may not pair well with a specific story and its qualities. In fact, when developing a story, the way it utilizes the medium should be on everybody's mind throughout the entirety of production. Most people in these fields probably don't even need to think about this, especially because most people stick to one medium. However, suspend your disbelief for a moment and imagine you've come up with a story that you want to make into a film or series or internet video or something. How do you decide whether it should be animated or live action? Again, I know this is rarely a decision that even has to be made, but work with me here. I think the place to start is by getting an understanding of the strengths of each medium. There's a sort of unwritten rule that if it can be done in live action, then it should be done in live action, and I would have to agree that that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Things can often be more impressive and impactful if they're pulled off in live action. It's pretty difficult to imagine a movie with a lot of special effects like Star Wars, Brazil, or The Thing being animated. They would lose all the intrigue of the special effects. A huge part of what makes movies like those so enjoyable is how the special effects work seamlessly to tell a story. Props, sets, animatronics, costumes, models, miniatures, and rear screen projections, it's all really impressive when executed well, and it's something that's entirely unique to live action. However, there are countless other ways that the medium of live action can use its unique attributes to be entertaining. Sometimes you just need to organize something that takes a lot of rehearsal and attempts to get right. Having a bunch of extras seems to get the job done. Imagine how much a shot like this would lose if it were animated. One director who I noticed doing this thing a lot is Michel Haneke, who seems to be able to direct each and every extra and make sure every person in a shot is doing something that looks entirely natural. If this was animated, you'd be taking away all the communication it took to create a shot like this, and you would probably have to cheat or it just wouldn't be practical. Kurosawa is a director who used a lot of crowds to make the reactions and emotions feel really big in a scene. Pair that with realistic costumes, props, special effects, and historical landmarks, and you got something that looks really cinematic. There's also a great sense of realism here, as if the filmmakers traveled back in time and somehow were able to get footage of real samurai armies fighting without being seen. That sort of thing really isn't possible with animation. One genre that I usually feel is kinda underwhelming when animated is action. Sure, it can be amazing, and we'll talk about that in the next section of the video, but stunts and choreography are often much more impressive when you can tell that real actors had to perform them. Or if cars have to actually perform them. Mad Max Fury Road took a bunch of cars to Namibia, Africa, and basically just filmed them destroying one another. And it's one of the most entertaining movies I've ever seen. A lot of this can really just be summed up as how hard was it to do? How many attempts, how much time, and how much hard work did it take to accomplish this and catch it on camera? Were you actually in the cold? Did you actually eat a raw fish? Did you actually just burn a house down? Or an oil rig? That stuff is mind-blowing. One way to really prove that a lot of hard work and planning and attempts were necessary to pull off a shot is just by making it really long. Or better yet, make your whole movie look like it's one shot. Or actually do a whole movie in one shot. Why not? It's more impressive. The oneer is definitely the most renowned type of shot, but there's a way to make it even more impressive, by adding the other things we talked about. Add special effects, add extras, add action, and oh my god! There really is nothing else like this scene from Children of Men, because it's seemingly impossible to get right. They had to get this all on one take too, because there's no cuts for nearly 4 minutes. The amount of coordination necessary to make sure all the actors are doing the right thing at the right time, and the camera moves are timed right, and the effects look good is mind-boggling. As far as I know, the only CGI here is the motorcycle flip, and the warning lights on the windshield. The windows are not green screens. They built this crazy car to have a stunt driver in the front and a small camera crew on top to move the camera around in the interior of the car. And I forgot to mention, it starts with the actors doing this. There's a scene from the movie Oldboy that pretty much encapsulates everything previously mentioned, and it's also probably the greatest action set piece ever. There's some great realism here because while this one guy is taking on a gigantic group of people in a fight, he's also doing it in a narrow hallway, which lets him pretty much take on one guy at a time, so it never feels like it's impossible for him to actually do this. For the dolly shot, they clearly had to recreate the hallway and leave one of the walls open for the camera to laterally track the character's progress. By the way, this dolly shot is unbroken by cuts for nearly 3 minutes. 3 minutes of great choreography and clumsy acting that helps you truly believe these characters are tired and afraid and beat down. Overall, it's just super impressive. Sometimes genre is everything. There's a reason they don't make a lot of animated romantic comedies, and some genres are literally impossible for animation to do, like Borat type movies. Movies with real people who don't realize that they're being filmed and are going to be part of a movie. There are a lot more of these than you think. Under the Skin films real people in Scotland without their knowledge to capture real-world reactions to the behavior to better illustrate the film's message. I guess Scottish people don't know who Scarlett Johansson is? My point being that you can't film real people if your movie is animated. Documentaries are another obvious example. You can't make an animated documentary, right? Actually, there's a movie called Tower that pulled it off pretty well, because the event depicted in the film happened so long ago that there was no footage available, so instead of cutting to footage, they just animated the event. Honestly, I hope more documentaries use animation to their advantage. But yes, generally documentaries are only live action. Horror is another genre that really is only done using live action, outside of YouTube at least. But honestly, I hope to see this change. You can do any crazy horrific thing you want using animation, so honestly, I don't really understand why it's so rare. Probably because animated movies are seen as something that's only for children. However, I think there's one more justified reason. Horror is often stronger when it's grounded in reality. Things are often a lot more scary when you can imagine yourself in the character's shoes. Being able to imagine something happen to you is basically the best way to scare people. The closest thing I've seen that could be classified as an animated horror film is Perfect Blue, but the important part of that movie is that it starts off really grounded. It spends most of the time at the beginning giving the viewer an understanding of the characters and the environment, and it all feels very realistic. They spend a lot of time just in Mima's apartment, setting up things to happen for the rest of the film. And while I really adore Perfect Blue, a lot of this could have been done in live action. The first third especially really feels like it's not utilizing animation in a lot of ways. But I'm not faulting the movie for this, I actually kind of like this choice. It makes the crazier stuff that happens near the end more jarring. But there still is a good part of this movie that kind of feels like it was intended for live action. And eventually, Darren Aronofsky basically remade Perfect Blue with the movie Black Swan. Honestly, I like these two movies pretty much equally. He recreated some of the shots for Requiem for a Dream too. Period pieces are another type of movie that I feel like pretty much always work better in live action. The only exceptions I think of are some Ghibli movies, but they still usually make sure to include things that aren't really possible with live action. I mean, the main character of Porco Rosso is a pig man. That sounds like it would be terrifying if it were live action. The real appeal to period pieces is being able to recreate an era and make it look realistic in every way so the audience can feel completely immersed in whatever time the film is set. Recreating or purchasing vehicles or objects from a specific time is part of the fun. Or if it's set way in the past, recreating paintings. The previously mentioned Ron looks like old Japanese paintings depicting frantic, chaotic warfare. In Barry Lyndon, every single shot looks like a painting from the 18th century, and the end result is just so gorgeous visually. War films are basically the same way. I mean, they're basically period pieces, but it's likely that the audience is going to want to see some live-action recreations of the warfare. And generally, war needs to be recreated with a lot of reverence. Not that animated films can't do this, though. Grave of the Fireflies is a great film about war, although the difference here is that it really isn't a movie about war. It's more about how war affects lots of people who don't deserve it at all, including innocent children. The super expressive character designs make it really easy for even children to emote and understand these characters. Child actors usually aren't able to do that very well. As great as Grave of the Fireflies is, I actually think the movie Come and See did the concept even better. Because in the movie Come and See, you feel like you're in the middle of a war. Nothing in this movie feels like an effect or like it was planned out. It just feels like you're watching an event unfold. This movie is about innocent children being in the middle of World War II, which obviously makes that way more upsetting. Oh, and you know that thing I said about it being hard to emote with child actors? Yeah, that's really not a problem here because the child acting is amazing. Easily one of the most brutal and horrific movies I've ever seen. Check it out! In general, films with genres that require realism or have themes that adapt well to a realistic portrayal should be live action. Obviously, crime movies like Reservoir Dogs or something like that just needs that sort of realism to be as enthralling as they are. My number one example of a movie that would be truly terrible if it were animated is 2001: A Space Odyssey. The entire point of the film is that it portrays a vision of the future, human evolution, and development, and it was executed with so much clarity that it's arguable that it inspired multiple advances in technology and accomplishment. All of this I believe would be completely lost if the movie was animated. The visuals would lose their clarity at realistically depicting the future for humanity, and just imagine if the ending was animated, like obviously it would stink, and it wouldn't be subverting the rest of the film's realism in the same way. There's really only one final strength I think live action has over animation, and that's performance. Although voice acting certainly requires a lot of skill, a live action performance is usually a lot more visceral and gripping, or at least it can be. There's nothing like an unsettling performance to really get an audience creeped out. And performance is obviously important to character. I mean, imagine Walter White's character without Bryan Cranston's performance. With nothing but the voice, it's like the entire presence of the character is stripped away. Performances and the mannerisms in an actor's performance certainly give character studies like Clockwork Orange, American Psycho, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Wolf of Wall Street, Apocalypse Now, Goodfellas, Tar, and There Will Be Blood a big boost because of their performances. Taxi Driver is the main one that sticks out in my mind. The main character's loneliness and transformation would just be so removed without the performance. The point is that animated movies really can't have this sort of thing. They can still have great acting, they can still have interesting characters, but you can't have the presence of an actor embodying a character in the same way. There are a lot of things you can do to make something impressive in live action. It's also probably the best form of storytelling to get an audience to imagine themselves in the shoes of a character. It's often more relatable because it's real. It's also just a great medium for creating impressive images. But any medium of storytelling can be impressive, especially if it's something unique and only possible with your selected medium. And with that, let's move on to animation. I said a good rule for live action is that if it can be done in live action, then it should be. But it's also a good rule of thumb for animation, because following this rule is probably the worst thing an animated movie can do. If it could be live action, if there's no reason for it to be animated, then people are going to ask themselves why it isn't just live action. So if you're going to make an animated movie, make sure there's some aspect of it that's impossible in live action. This just generally makes for a more entertaining, more unique, and more interesting experience. Cartoons obviously use impossible, unrealistic scenarios to their advantage to tell jokes, but I also think more serious animated movies need to think about this kind of thing. One of my favorite animated movies is Akira, a film that would just be impossible to remake in live action. I mean, they're going to try, but there's insane mechanical mutant body horror, there's telekinesis, there's nuclear explosions, there's crazy dream sequences, there's children that look like old people, there's apocalyptic collateral damage to a futuristic Tokyo, there's psychedelic visuals that represent a character embodying a universe, there's levitating military equipment, there's futuristic hospital examination machines, and finally, the light leaves a little trace when the bike goes by. Isn't that neat? This stuff makes the movie exciting. It's not every day you see a movie where a universe is made in it. All in all, I just think it would be impossible to execute this, even with a budget of $1 billion, let alone one that's reasonable. I mean, you could just CGI a bunch of this stuff, but those expenses add up, and also CGI is animation anyways, so would that even be live action? If they do make a live action remake, they're gonna have to make some serious changes, or this just isn't gonna be doable. And if you made it live action, you'd lose all this artistry, the hundreds of thousands of frames hand painted to create each and every light in the building. I think the greatest distinction between live action and animation is live action usually tries to look real to an extent. Obviously something like, I don't know, Lord of the Rings doesn't look real, but it does look about as real as you could probably depict Middle Earth in the early 2000s. But animation doesn't need to try to look real, you can personify anything. Utilizing animation, you can make an audience empathize with anything, as long as the character design and writing assists you to understand the character and help you emote with them. It's what Pixar does all the time. What if toys had feelings? What if bugs had feelings? What if fish had feelings? What if cars had feelings? What if rats had feelings? What if robots had feelings? What if feelings had feelings? What if Italians had feelings? Maron! Getting the viewer to feel emotion for something that isn't real, that isn't even supposed to look real, is an achievement in writing and character design choices, and it's why animated movies often work really well for children. When kids connect with a character or anything in a story, it helps them gain a personality and empathy, and that's what's so great about Pixar, Ghibli, Disney, and DreamWorks, and it's why animated movies like this are basically worthless. Speaking of Illumination animation, let's talk about one of their other monstrosities, Sing. As far as I'm concerned, Sing is one of the worst animated movies ever. You know, at least with a budget. I'm not counting this stuff. Although, I do kinda love ratatouille. I even made my AP Lit class watch it. But anyways, back to Sing. When personifying inanimate objects or animals or whatever, you have to make sure there's a reason you're doing it. The only reason the characters in Sing are animals is because they're more appealing to children than humans would be. And as a result, the movie feels really cynical. Some of the worst animated movies ever have this problem. In Shark Tale, there really isn't a point to the characters being fish, although at least in Shark Tale it takes place underwater. Sing literally just takes place in grocery stores or fancy restaurants or public swimming pools, and everything just looks incredibly flat. Even Ratatouille had more creative visual storytelling. Anyways, Shark Tale is basically just a kid's mobster movie, but they're fish. Will Fish works at a car wash. He gets a gift lava lamp, but he's a fish. Why are they fish if they're just going to do things humans do? Why are they animals if they're just going to compete in a singing competition? It's important that what you decide to personify meshes with the story you tell, or the end result is going to be really bad. And yeah, I know this is the strengths of animation portion of the video, but I'm only ripping on these movies to highlight how special it can make a film when it gets it right. In Fantastic Mr. Fox, they utilize the traits of foxes and other animals to make a film about characters who can't change who they are. If the characters in Fantastic Mr. Fox, or The Lion King, or Zootopia, or Finding Nemo, or any other competent story with animal characters were all turned into humans, the stories wouldn't make sense. And this sort of thing isn't limited to personification. In The Incredibles, each one of the characters' powers is a reflection of their personality and arc. Violet can go invisible because she's shy. Stash can run fast because he's an energetic kid and wants to show off that he's a superhero. Bob has super strength because he's frustrated about being in hiding. And Helen can stretch her limbs because she's a mom taking on too much at once. And The Incredibles isn't the only Pixar movie like this. There's a reason why the new toy in Toy Story is an astronaut and the old toy is a cowboy. There's a reason why the animals cooking meals in Ratatouille are specifically rats. There's a reason why Wall-E is junky looking with rust and gears and Eve is smooth and modern. And there's even motivation behind the characters in Up having round faces versus blocky faces. Because if these choices were made arbitrarily, these movies would be a lot less thematic and would end up being a lot more dull. You don't even have to leave the realm of Pixar to see examples of this. Not to say they're necessarily bad movies, but Soul and Luca both have sort of a mystical element that just feels completely shoehorned in. I would have honestly preferred a movie about some kids in an Italian town or just a middle school band teacher. And while these fantasy elements do have an important purpose in the plot, it still feels like these stories could have been told in a much more mature and poignant way without them. And in the case of my two least favorite Pixar movies, there's literally no reason you needed to make your James Bond parody about cars. And in The Good Dinosaur, the dinosaurs could have been almost anything and the story would remain the same. And the results are a jarring mess and a really bland, forgettable movie. That's another thing about those earlier Pixar movies, is that they're really memorable. The designs of the characters in Monster Inc. are ingrained in my mind, not just because they're unique, but because looking at them, you know everything you need to about the characters. You don't have to hear their voices or even seen the movie to know what James P. Sullivan, Mike Wazowski, and Randall Boggs are all like. You can tell what they're like just by looking at them. And you can read their emotions just with a glance. That's great character design. This movie isn't even out yet and I can tell there's going to be a big problem with it, because all these characters look completely lifeless and creepy, and the result is the audience can't connect with them. How on earth do you expect me to emote with a real lion or real baboon or real teapot or fish or whatever? You can't. The reason we can emote and relate with these characters and not these ones is because they're so expressive. They're personified with human facial expressions and other human qualities, so when I look at this bear or this monkey or this lion, they look friendly. When I look at this monkey or this bear or this lion, all I see are cold, black, dead eyes with no emotion. Nothing. And it's creepy! I heard that Jon Favreau wanted to make the lions emote the way they do in real life, and that sounds like the worst idea ever. Humans can't understand or connect with the way lions emote in the real world. Why would you want anything to be real in your movie about lions being king of the jungle? Because this is the result. In the original, I can tell Zazu is bowing to Mufasa to show respect for him as a king, and Mufasa appreciates this and sees Zazu as a friend. In the new film, it genuinely looks like Zazu is showing off his wings, and then Mufasa is confused and then looks into space. The only way you can tell what's going on here is if you've seen the original. This is obviously a problem in this scene, but it's a massive problem in the more dramatic scenes, like Mufasa's death. In the original, I can see it on Mufasa's face that he needs his brother to save him, but then is forced to realize that this was all a way for Scar to arrange his murder. He's shocked that his brother would be willing to betray him in this moment, but then has no choice but to let himself die in the stampede. None of this is communicated through facial expressions in the new film, because how could they? And the result is it feels completely antiseptic. It's like if you made a remake of A Bug's Life that looked like this. Are you starting to get why I don't like these live-action reboots? By the way, they're not even live action. That Lion King movie is entirely animated. These remakes just sort of highlight how good the originals are. Will Smith's attempt at the genie just shows off how amazing Robin Williams' performance was. The genie is probably the greatest example of how a vocal performance can translate to animation, for comedy, and just to be really entertaining by animating all the impressions and references he makes with his voice. On the topic of voice acting, there's a few more things I want to mention. Mainly that when voicing a character, physical attributes don't really matter at all. If you wanted to make a movie about, I don't know, Steve Jobs, you need an actor that was the correct ethnicity, correct gender, correct heights, age, facial structure, builds. But if you made an animated movie about any well-known person, you're not limited by the actor's physical attributes at all. I mean, technically speaking, anyone can play anyone. Although, you're still going to want to choose someone who's appropriate for the role. One that really sticks out in my mind is Jeremy Irons' portrayal of Scar. His voice just has so much ferocity and it fits the character perfectly. Does anybody want to argue that Scarlett Johansson's voice fits the porcupine from Sing perfectly, or that Fred Armisen just had to play Cranky Kong? The people who made the movies just know shoving their name in the trailer a few times would help get butts in the seats. If you're not convinced that voice acting matters that much, just watch any anime and switch back and forth between the dub and sub. In most cases, the dub is going to be so bad that it's going to prevent you from getting immersed in the story. But the voice acting isn't always bad. The guy who does the dub for Spike and Cowboy Bebop did such a great job at portraying the character that I'm bombarded by ads for Steve Blum to teach me how to voice act on Instagram. I haven't even mentioned yet the fact that there are different types of animation. 2D, 3D, stop motion, different forms of stop motion like claymation or that paper cutout thing that South Park and Fantastic Planet do. And then there's some things that kind of muddy the line between animation and live action, like puppetry. Is Team America World Police an animated movie or a live action one? And while it is considered a form of animation, in many ways stop motion shares more qualities with live action. You have to build actual sets and props and there's real lighting. The only thing that keeps it animated is the illusion of movement. Which live action has too. I mean, it's really just 24 frames a second being projected through a bulb. Whichever one of these types of animation you choose should have a reason behind it. Personally, I have a bit of a preference for 2D instead of 3D, but 3D animation definitely has its place. One of my favorite examples is the Lego Movie. People were fooled that it was stop motion because the 3D animation was so convincing. The way it's lit, the way they play with the frame rates just makes the movie look like stop motion, and it's clear the simple design of Lego is pretty easy for the animators to render. 9 years later and it still looks great. On a similar note, making the first computer animated movie about toys was pretty ingenious. They were only able to animate simple shapes and textures, so toys were pretty much all that was convincing. The humans and animals may look like toys too, but whatever. As dated as it is, for being 3 decades old, it looks pretty good. The Let It Go scene from Frozen works really well with 3D animation because of the way they're able to move the camera around the 3D environment. 3D animation can really work well with certain stories, but I'm also starting to really miss 2D animated movies. They're just not made anymore. Stop motion is usually seen as creepier than other forms of animation, and understandably so, which kind of makes it perfect for telling creepy kid stories like Coraline or Nightmare Before Christmas. If these movies were live action, they would probably be way too scary for kids, but if they were 2D or 3D, they'd probably look too cartoony. Stop motion is that perfect balance. I've noticed that if live action directors start to experiment with animation, they usually go for stop motion. Stop motion seems to really fit Wes Anderson's style, as he gets to make symmetrical sets and do lighting the way he usually does, but it's animated. Also, something about his awkward, stilted dialogue really works with stop motion. Charlie Kaufman and Duke Johnson's Anomalisa is just such a masterpiece. The fact that animating these puppets' faces require you to take them off and replace them is actually utilized by the movie in just such a brilliant way. But the greatest accomplishment of this movie is that it's animated and yet feels much more realistic than pretty much any other movie I've seen. It's genius, as is every Charlie Kaufman movie. Please watch it. It's also a great example of why public perception of animation needs to change. This was up against Shaun of the Sheep and Inside Out for Best Animated Feature at the 2016 Oscars. My point is not that those movies are bad, but they're not at all comparable to Anomalisa. Animated movies have so much variety, to treat them all like they have the same goals is just wild to me. One show that's really clever in the form of animation they chose is South Park. It's not fitting because the animation is good, it's a good decision because the animation is crappy. Bad animation could be a good choice too. The crudeness makes the animation look absurd and funnier. Also, the simplicity of it lets the writers get away with a whole lot more than they would otherwise. But the main thing that's very beneficial about the animation style they chose is it allows the show to be completed in a short amount of time. There's a documentary about the show that goes over the process of an episode. Basically, every episode is made in only 6 days, and according to Brock Baker, it's now only 5. This lets the show stay relevant, and Trey Parker and Matt Stone seem to think rushing episodes out in a short amount of time helps them stay funny and creative. Another example I want to bring up is BoJack Horseman. I've heard a lot of people say the animation is bad, but could you imagine if it looked like this? Of course not. This show is basically written like a stage play, so the fact that the animation is simple and stilted to one angle is actually a really good choice. The final strength of animation I want to talk about is something that I don't think people think about a lot. Editing. You can really transition shots any way you like, and because of that, you can get really creative in ways impossible for live action. Take this shot in Paprika. There are a ton of match cuts in this movie because it fits the story about transitioning between dreams and reality, and all the cuts keep you on your toes. Animation also has less visual detail than live action, so you can cut between things a lot more quickly. Or you can implement multiple frames at once without it being as overwhelming. It's Such a Beautiful Day by Don Hertzfeldt is the most creative movie I've seen in terms of this sort of thing, implementing live action, real lighting, and compiling it with the animation in a bunch of different ways. With animation, there's really endless possibilities with this kind of thing, but I feel like they're rarely utilized, so be creative with your editing, it can go a long way. I want to close this video out by talking a bit about CGI, because at this point you can kind of do whatever you want and make it realistic as long as you have the budget for it. I saw Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 the other night, and I'm not going to say the movie would have been better if it were animated, but would it have made much of a difference? The movie is 95% CGI anyways. I've seen pretty much every Marvel movie at this point, and the formula is getting really tiring for me. I honestly feel like animation might be able to spice it up a bit. They'd get crazier and more creative with the storytelling and not be limited by live action. Into the Spider-Verse was so stylish in pretty much every way, and part of the reason it was so good is because it subverted the superhero movie blueprint and did something experimental with the medium. But the suggestion is kind of pointless because I really doubt Marvel or DC are going to start making animated movies. So maybe I should suggest something else. Maybe try to get more creative with live action as a medium and limit the amount of CGI you use a bit. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2 is a great point of comparison because in that movie they really built and puppeteered Doc Ock's mechanical arms. 2 decades later, this still looks great. Sure, they did CGI the arms when they needed to, but Spider-Man No Way Home CGI'd them for the entire movie. Not that this really impacted my enjoyment of the film in any significant way, but it's part of a bigger problem. Marvel just doesn't utilize live action in a lot of interesting ways. One way this did impact my enjoyment of the new Spider-Man trilogy is the way they're shot. The cinematography is almost never creative. Conversations are always shot reverse shot with an A camera and a B camera. It's like a sitcom. In Spider-Man Far From Home, they really overused the telephoto lenses for pretty much the entire movie, so the whole thing looks really zoomed in and kind of claustrophobic. The movie takes place in beautiful locations, but you're barely able to see any of them because the camera is zoomed in too far. Not even the action scenes are creatively shot, and most of the time they're barely dynamic at all, so they end up using music to boost the energy. Now compare all that with this one scene in Spider-Man 2. Shots are dynamic, but it's always motivated, like the camera moving along with Spider-Man or Doc Ock's arms. There are still shots to break up the energy, as you don't want to be constantly moving the camera around, that would just be exhausting. But these motionless shots are also a way to be dramatic and scary. This scene is super over the top, like an old horror movie, which makes the villain genuinely threatening while also making him kinda silly. My favorite aspect of this scene is the POV shots from the perspective of the robotic arms. And they climax the scene with some creative editing by showing 4 of the POVs at once. So please, get more creative with your filmmaking and cinematography. Part of the reason The Dark Knight is seen as one of the best superhero movies is because it did some really cool practical stuff, like flipping over an 18-wheeled truck in the middle of Chicago's banking district. Now I want to make it clear that I don't hate CGI. My favorite movie of all time uses CGI a lot. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be implemented well and implemented poorly. Films that want to show off their capabilities like some sort of tech demo seem to age the worst. It's usually the films that use CGI sparingly and with the assistance of other effects that age the best. People are usually surprised how much David Fincher uses CGI in his movies because he does it pretty subtly. In Jurassic Park, the T-Rex looks way better than the Bronciosauruses and the Gallimimus. Yes, I was a dinosaur kid. Anyways, the reason why the Tyrannosaurus Rex looks way better than the Parasaurolophus is because the rain and dark lighting hide the imperfections in the CGI, rather than just exposing it in daylight. They also use a puppeteered T-Rex as much as possible. Even if characters like Gollum look kinda dated, the CGI isn't very distracting because the performance is good and the character is interesting. I doubt Thanos is gonna look bad 15 years down the road for the same reason. I think it's completely fine to have a preference for either live action or animation. Personally, I find the production of both to be endlessly fascinating. However, I don't think it's reasonable to say that one is better than the other, or that it should be taken more seriously than the other. The truth is, some stories should be animated and some should be live action. And it's ridiculous to think that every story would be improved if it were animated or live action. Both mediums are very capable at making great stories come to life. The main point I want to make with this video is that every choice you make when telling a story should have a purpose, and every choice should utilize your medium in an interesting way. It gives the method you told your story a purpose. Media can have a really profound impact on people, but if you're going to make something of value, then your decisions need to be made deliberately, especially something as important as the form in which you tell your story. I want to quickly thank everyone who commented on the first part of this video, which I'm now realizing was uploaded 2 years ago. Oh my god, has this been on the back burner for a while. Anyways, I really do appreciate you guys continuing the discussion in the comments. Some of the comments in part 1 were really helpful when making this video. The next video should be out pretty soon. I'd say about in like 17 years. I'm just kidding. Anyways, I will see you then. Peace.